This is Dave at AFX Search, licensed private investigators in Palm Beach, Florida. Hi again to all of our viewers, and we're going to talk about fraud investigations. If you are an investigator or even a potential victim in a fraud case, this information might be helpful. First of all, if you start an investigation against a fraud or against a Ponzi scheme or do an asset recovery, you want to start with the belief and philosophy that the fraudster is not the only one who caused your damages. There are many other people that may be involved. A fraudster needs an army of people, an army of resources, assistants, enablers, vendors, contractors, gatekeepers, promoters, accountants, banks, in order to commit their fraud. Not all of them may be willing participants. Not all of them might be assisting with something they think is a fraud, but it doesn't change the fact that each one had an opportunity to terminate the fraud at some point. The first question you want to ask, did any? Are there any third parties that actually took action to stop the fraudster? And if there are, we'll leave those aside for a minute. We'll get back to that. One way to determine if any of the enablers extended the fraud is to know and learn the industry requirements, best practices, standards of a certain business, laws, licensing of that industry segment. So you can tell if a bank, an accountant, a vendor, a contractor didn't follow their guidelines or normal course of business when working with this fraudster. Even if they didn't actively participate in the fraud, if they cut a corner, if they allowed a procedure to happen that's not normal, well, they might have some liability. In fact, they probably will have some liability. So the first thing is know the requirements of each of those different industries. You need to become kind of a jack of all trades and know a little bit about different industries and businesses to be able to do this. Now you can go and look and say, hey, look, you as a contractor normally should have pulled a permit for this electrical wire that got run here, but you didn't because you knew that if you did, it would open up a can of worms about this fraud, and that might be a reason that that contractor is involved. Some technical knowledge might be required. You may want to interview somebody else in that business, somebody else who's a banker, accountant, or contractor to get some ideas about your case. You can keep it vague. In some cases, there are very specific requirements. In the banking industry, there's FINRA requirements. There's required documents for a corporation to sign when they're making transfers. Could be a corporate resolution. They may be principals signing off on a wire transfer. In addition, there's what's called SARs, suspicious activity reports, that a bank has to file anytime there's something that they deem suspicious. There's some very specific examples of what's suspicious, but in some cases it's arbitrary. If the bank sees something that's not normal for that client, they fill out an SAR, it goes to the federal government. Now, that may not be something available to a private party civil lawsuit, but if there's a criminal investigation, that may be something that's brought into the criminal investigation, and you can ask to see if SARs were filled out or should they have been filled out. Secondly, everyone at some times or another in their course of business may cut a corner. However, that's going to happen more so when the scenario is questionable. If the fraudster is doing something that is questionable or that's illegal or that's not allowed in their course of business, they may cut more corners and invite or suggest or ask some of their business partners to do the same thing. Look, don't fill out this paperwork on this deal for me. Do me a favor. Leave that place blank on the form. Do me a favor and don't make that phone call you're supposed to do. If you can see that that was done, the assistant, the vendor, the enabler may not have looked at that as a really serious thing at the time. Hey, I'm just not filling out this form. Hey, I left that place blank. But if it turns out that that's what enabled that fraud to happen, it will seem like a much bigger deal to that company later, and they may want to settle or have their insurance company get involved if there's a big claim for a fraud later down the road. And if you're a victim, let an investigator look deeply at all these records to see if there was any examples of anybody else extending the fraud, deepening the loss, allowing that fraudster to operate longer than he would have otherwise. Look, a fraudster is going to try to commit the fraud no matter what. If they run into the right group of enablers or businesses they deal with that don't question things, they can run that fraud longer than they would have and not get shut down. And that's where you as a victim have an exposure of loss against maybe some of these other people. So start with the belief that, look, the fraudster is not your only avenue to pursue. There's other people that help them, knowingly or not, and each one of those people is a source to look at in an investigation to see, first of all, if they did it voluntarily and they knew it was a fraud, or should they have known and they did turn a blind eye. Asset recovery, getting back some of this money, hinges on looking at these third parties who helped them do it and who may have liability to pay back the victims.